Welcome to The Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at thetwotestaments.com. Follow us on Twitter at @2testaments or ask questions in our Facebook group.
Welcome to The Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And I'm Will Kynes.
And in this episode, we're looking at Job chapter 42, Job's response to the divine speeches, and the narrative epilogue, the conclusion. And we're joined today by Dr. Carol Newsom.
Welcome, Carol.
Thank you.
Carol Newsom is the Charles Howard Candler Professor Emerita of Old Testament at Candler School of Theology. And I am incredibly excited to have her on the podcast here to finish up our discussion of the book of Job. This is certainly one of those situations where it's last but not least at all. Carol is, in my view, one of the most influential scholars on the book of Job, at least for me personally, behind my supervisor, Catherine Dell. Her book here, The Book of Job, A Contest of Moral Imaginations, is one of my favorite books on the book of Job. And I mean, it's deep. And so for many listeners, it might be a little bit much to take on, but if you can dive into it, there's just so much richness there for understanding Job. And we'll get to some of that, why I find it so helpful as we go along in her discussion. But if you want something slightly more accessible,
but bigger,
but not accessible to lift.
It's not the whole book.
Within this large volume, the New Interpreter's Bible, Volume 4, is her commentary on Job. And that's more accessible. And it also includes reflections on the theological meaning and the application of the book, which could be really helpful for people who are thinking about Bible studies or sermons or other things like that. So Carol is one of these people who seems to me to be just constantly ransacking the world, looking for new ideas that she can apply to understanding the Bible in new and interesting, fascinating ways. And so I'm always excited to read her work and now to have the opportunity to talk with her in person about Job. It's just a great moment for me personally.
Yeah, well, I'll say that Carol's work ranges not only in Hebrew Bible, but also in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah,
I mean, she's a very influential scholar on some of the Qumran literature.
Right. So there's been some overlap.
So I've been forced to engage with Carol's work, and delighted to as well, of course.
Well, I have learned from your work as well, so it's mutual.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Carol. The first question we like to start with is, what first drew you to Job? You put a lot of time into thinking about Job. How did you get here?
Well, when I first got my job at Emory, they called me up and they said, well, you're replacing the person who taught wisdom literature, so you'll be teaching a course on wisdom literature. I had not studied wisdom literature in my graduate program, so it was simply I had to learn enough in order to teach my class. And once I got involved in teaching this class regularly, Job quickly became just a fascinating text for me. So it was teaching that led me into wanting to do writing about Job.
Could you talk a little bit more about what it was that fascinated you about Job initially?
I kept realizing how I wasn't fully understanding the book. And every time I would read it, something about it would push back on me. And I thought, okay, I'm trying to make it say this because I'd like for it to say that, but I'm not so sure that's what it's saying. And I would say that has been a lifelong challenge to really listen to the book, as well as the fact that it engages you so much that you do find yourself in dialogue with it.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to that as we look at how some of these crucial verses here in chapter 42 are interpreted. Yeah.
How do you see Job chapter 42 fitting into the book as a whole? Does it provide a fitting conclusion, you think?
Oh, in one sense, it's sort of it's like the end of a symphony, when all of the instruments play together and it's telling you this is the wrap up, this is the conclusion, let's bring out the bass drums and the strings and everything. But of course, it has just come in out of nowhere almost, because we've been involved in this incredible poetry between God and Job. So I think we have to go back and think about the structure of the book as a whole, because as obviously your readers, the people who've been listening to your podcast know, it starts out with this prose tale. And then that prose tale gets interrupted by this large section of demanding poetry. And then suddenly at the end, back comes the prose. So I don't know, at least when I was a little girl growing up, I had these funny little cartoon-like books, which had pictures of animals, but every page was cut into 3 segments. And so you could flip one segment and not another. So you might have something that had the head of a horse, but then you could turn the page and get the body of a bear and then the feet of a duck. So reading the book of Job is a little bit like having one of those books, except we've got the head of the let's say the head of the horse, and then the body of the chicken, and then the feet of the horse come back in. Yeah. And you have to say, I knew how to fit those together if it's all a horse, right. But how do I fit them together when they're 2 such different things? So I think in part that ending, despite the fact that it looks like it's a wrap up, if anything, it's drawing us back to the reminder that things don't entirely wrap up so easily. Mm-hmm. I don't think it wants us just to say, okay, now got that, I can move on.
Okay.
So it's disturbing.
Right. Okay. So some people don't like the epilogue because they think it ties everything up too neatly at the end of the book.
Yeah.
But you actually think that the way that the epilogue creates this kind of dissonance with what we have become accustomed to in the book up to that point, it puts the reader on their back foot in a way. Okay.
Yeah,
so
we have to negotiate it.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So we've got to figure out, because it's not going to make things easy for us. And so therefore it both fits and it doesn't fit. And I think we have to stay with that tension and sort of see where it leads us, but also recognize that because it doesn't let us wrap things up, this is what keeps us going back and rereading the book.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you're reading chapter 42, and we're going to get into into detail in a second, but just to get started, what for you in this chapter is the most difficult interpretive issue?
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing about what I've discovered in teaching is that probably, as you were suggesting, when I teach this, a lot of my students did not like the ending. And so I would try to listen and see what it was that was irritating them about it. And I realized they were still focused on, they didn't like what God had said to Job. And they didn't like the fact that then it just seemed to move to the happy ending. And so they were really hung up on how God appears in the epilogue. And it's a perfectly legitimate thing to be focused on. But I said, what if we put that aside for a minute and say, let's look at Job. Job doesn't say a single word during the epilogue. It alludes to him praying on behalf of his friends, but we don't hear anything from him. It tells us he named his daughters, but we don't hear his words. All we can go on as to what his state of mind is what he does. And when I suggest people read it that way, they hear something really different in the epilogue, because they look at this person who has discovered that the world is not at all the way he thought it was, the way he wanted it to be. He's experienced incredible loss. And what are the major things that he does? He welcomes the family that have come. He eats with them. He has he has sex again with his wife because they bring 10 more children into the world. And so what he does is to re-embrace life. Mm-hmm. And so I asked the students, I said, if we are just shift to looking at that, how do we think about what the epilogue might mean? Because I think it means something different when we stop just focusing on our judgments about God.
Okay.
And in that sense, it can in some ways be a really fascinating conclusion because it reminds us of the stories of other survivors who have had a choice about whether they're going to live out the rest of their lives in moral bitterness, yep, or whether they're going to say, I've lost a lot, but I'm still going to embrace life. So that just makes it a very different kind of ending.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it points to two things. One is, one of the things that I appreciate about your book, A Contest of Moral Imaginations, is you take the struggles that people have had with interpreting Job, and you turn them around into opportunities to understand the book in a deeper way, which you've just demonstrated to us right here. But then secondly, that one way to think about how the book as a whole fits together is that with suffering for Job comes isolation. Right? Isolation from his community, isolation from God. So one of the things that we're seeing in the epilogue is his rejoining community, and potentially his restoration of his relationship with God.
Can you all clarify what is it about the ending? And maybe we're going to get about to get into this, but what is it about the ending that some people say doesn't fit with what comes before?
Yeah. Well, could you kind of elaborate when your students are struggling with it? You said they struggle with the depiction of God, but what is it exactly that they're wrestling with?
Well, they don't think, and again, how you read the epilogue depends a lot on how you read the divine speeches and Job's response to them. So if they have not been satisfied with the divine speeches, then they feel as though Job's questions have not been answered, that he hasn't been adequately addressed, and that he's getting just a payoff at the end. Right. And so for them, it's not a resolution of the issues that they have been engaged in. But as I say, so much depends on how people understand what's gone before.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's also people who will read it and they'll be disappointed because the Job who wrestles with God is this kind of tragic hero. And they kind of wish that the book had just ended there.
Yeah.
And it's disappointing. It's a letdown. It's anticlimactic for him to no longer be that tragic hero, but for him to accept this restitution from God and just go back into normal life. But that's not the kind of narrative that they want the story.
Because how is it a true test of his piety?
Yeah.
Right. In the very beginning, if in the end it all works out.
Right. And the idea that those who see the book attacking this doctrine of retribution, then it just reinforces retribution.
Right. That's what the friend said was going to happen. Sure did.
So we might be able to circle back to some of those issues.
Yeah. It's, I think we've gone through a number of the different ways in which people might find it disturbing. And every time you come to it, you read something different that you hadn't quite thought about before.
Yeah. So let's look at 42, 2-4. So we've listened to God's great speeches to Job. Whether we can figure out exactly what God is trying to communicate there, you can listen to our previous episode with Bill Brown and think through those questions. But here's how Job responds. He says, I know, I'm reading the NRSV here, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And then we've got, it appears to be a quotation. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And back to it appears Job's speech. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And then another apparent quotation. Hear and I will speak. I will question you and you declare to me. Okay, we'll just stop there for now.
Okay. Yeah.
What is going on there with these apparent quotations that Job is using in his response to God?
This is one of the few clues we have as to what he thinks about what he has just heard. And obviously, it does mean that he has been really taking in what he understands God to have said. And so he's going back and he recapitulates a little bit each perspective. He almost embodies the God perspective talking to him. Mm-hmm. And so he's saying, I recognize that. And I did speak about things that I haven't understood. So it seems to indicate he's undergoing a certain kind of shift in perspective. And at least entertaining that the perspective that he had previously brought is not the only possible perspective, perhaps not the most adequate perspective. So you see someone who he doesn't tell us substantively what it is he's gotten. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that the author doesn't want Job to do our work for us.
Okay.
So we're all listening to say, what could you please explain God's speech to me? And Job clearly indicates that something has shifted in him and in that experience. But he does it so elusively that we are not off the hook for thinking ourselves about what was it we just heard. Right. But it does signal a shift, I think.
Yeah. And I mentioned the influence of your work on my thinking on Job. And one of the big things is this idea of dialogue in Job. So here we have in Job's response to God, the fact that he speaks with God's word, right? He's kind of incorporating dialogue even into his response to Job is a pointer to how crucial that is throughout the book. You want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah. I think this book is an exercise in incorporating different perspectives into a complex understanding. Because I don't think any of the voices that speak in this book are there just to be dismissed. I think each one of them has something that is true to say. But here, where Job had been so certain of his own position, now he's having that relativized, at least, by participating in the divine perspective. So he's seeing things from a different perspective, though it's not clear that anyone could absorb and work through the significance of all of that in an instant. Right. So I think it's just gesturing to what is probably the beginning of a process.
Right. And so it's an acknowledgement here that this search for meaning, search for truth emerges through conversation with another. And one of the things that Carol points to is that we as readers get drawn into that conversation. So she's already alluded to this a couple times, and it's going to come up again, I imagine. That the way that the book is written pulls us into that. So we're seeing hints at this already in Job. Here.
Right. And we see that then in verse 5, because he has just recapitulated in some way what God says when he quotes and he says, when he says, hear and I will speak. Now in verse 5, he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you.
Yeah.
Now, Carol, what's the difference between Job's former knowledge and perhaps some new knowledge that he's gained by sight? Is that different than the knowledge he's had by hearing?
Yeah. It's interesting how they use hearing and seeing, because these are both recognized as ways in which people gain knowledge and understanding. And it's not clear really that one or the other is completely privileged over the other in Hebrew tradition. But in this theophany, that's an immediate encounter with the divine. And so even though it's, obviously we're in a literary book, it's all words, but it has that quality of immediacy. And so I think that's what he names by seeing. And so previously the hearing, I think, is more the, if you will, what he has assumed, what tradition has taught him, even what his own constructions of reality have led him to think. But all of that has been, if you will, a human construction of God and the divine in the world. And in this, which is deeply experiential, he comes across another way of apprehending reality, which has challenged and transformed what he thought he knew. And I think many people have had those moments in their lives in which some powerful experience really rearranges your sense of the world. So I think that he is, again, signaling that something fundamental has shifted for him, though we're not told exactly what.
But is that shift for him dependent on revelation then?
Yeah.
And what's behind my question is this idea that in the quote unquote wisdom literature, revelation is put aside because wisdom literature is focusing on rationalism and universalism. But do you think that this Job here towards the end is actually privileging revelation?
That may depend on what we mean by revelation. What I would like here is the term encounter, and I'm thinking both about Karl Barth, and he's talking about God as the wholly other, and so this is the revelatory moment that explodes your categories and your assumptions, and so it is the overwhelming. Rudolf Otto also speaks of this, the mysterious nature of the divine. And so that, I think, is, and yes, I do think that it is a challenge to a book like Proverbs, which seems much more confident about analogy and the similarity between human wisdom and divine wisdom. And here, I think one comes up against an expression of the limits of that.
Yeah, that's great. One last question on this first, because I love this first, and I think it's crucial for our understanding of the book. Some will see this when he talks about knowing God by hearing, that former knowledge. They'll see that as what's reflected in the prologue. And then what we see here is what his experience of God emerges through the dialogues and then ultimately to him in the divine speeches. Do you have any thoughts on that way of understanding this first?
I mean, in one sense, Job has had two different ways of thinking about God. One in the prologue, in which he is the model of, I call this the Buddhist Job, the Job of non-attachment to, to everything. But it's a mode of thinking about God that allows him to incorporate trauma and disaster without feeling alienated from God. But he discovers he can't hold on to that. And so the middle part, he has a different way of thinking about God, anger at the failure of reciprocity, of justice, of apparent caring. And so, I think that this shock here encompasses or explodes the categories by which he thought about God in both the dialogue and the prologue. The epilogue, and this goes back to what the epilogue's doing there. This is not going to be just a return to the status quo ante. He is not going back to the same place that he was before.
All right, here we go. 42:6. Here's the $1 million question. How do we understand 42:6? Let me read it for you in the NRSV translation, just to get us started. NRSV says, "Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." So that's the NRSV, but there are about as many translations of this verse as there are scholars who have attempted to translate this verse. Could you walk us through some of the ways that it could be translated, and then talk to us a little bit about how you personally prefer to translate it?
For the longest time, we thought we knew what this verse meant. And then a while back, a scholar named Dale Patrick said, guess what? It's really not that simple. And so he went through a number of different ways. And ever after that, that's what gave rise to people saying, wow, it's really ambiguous. Now, the analogy I like comes from Monty Python's Life of Brian, which is a great theological text. And if you remember that scene at the Sermon on the Mount, We can hear Jesus talking, but we're with the crowd way back at the edge, and they can't quite hear what's going on. And they're trying to make out what he said. I said, what is this? Blessed are the cheesemakers, or the Greeks will inherit the earth. So when we read verse 6, we're sort of like that. We can see the words on the page, but it's really difficult to make sense of them, in part because apart from the first word, therefore, everything else can be translated in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
And so once again, we're back to putting this piece with that piece with that piece. Now, I think that the NRSV, and I think that goes back to the King James Version as well, that one is almost certainly not right.
Okay.
Even though it's the most familiar, it's almost certainly not right. And we'll sort of get into that. Let me just go through each of the words and say a little bit about why they're so ambiguous. The first word that the NRSV translates as, therefore, I despise myself. There's no myself in the text. And that word that means despise can mean despise. It basically means, it's a kind of a visceral word, and it means, ooh, I have a gut feeling of dislike or distaste or disgust. And so it's a visceral word, but it normally has an object. I don't like, or I have a repugnance for, or a repudiation of something. Here, it's just used. There's no object. Now, it can have an assumed object, and that's what the NRSV does. Other people will say, no, he doesn't mean I despise myself. He means, ooh, I dislike and I reject my words, what I've been saying, which might go well with what we've just been talking about, a change in view.
Right. So people who read it that way might translate it recant or something.
Yeah. Although that's a little heady, whereas this is, I don't like, what I've said. So it's, and there are others who, we'll come to a couple of the radical ones in a minute. Let's stick with the,
recant sounds like a heresy trial.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so, but there are people who read the book of Job as having a lot of legal language in it. And so that would be a term that would fit in well with that construal. Right. Now, the next word I think is really crucial. In Hebrew, it's the word that has to do with basically changing one's mind or grasp of a situation and one's disposition toward it. So it can mean, I've changed my mind. It can mean, I regret that my disposition has changed in that way. It can also mean, I am comforted in that I've changed my disposition or my relationship to a situation of loss. And these are all really well attested forms. I find consolation. So that's a way of talking about it. I think that repent, although it's not outside the bounds, that's a little more theological than it's mostly used for. Right. But it does, again, it's consistent with what we're seeing is that Job does seem to be saying, I've shifted in some regard. Now, we'll leave that one where it stands for a minute, because I'll come back to that. That the last few words, upon dust, or let's see, the NRSV again was
in dust and ashes.
In dust and ashes. Okay. No, it's not in. It is either upon or concerning.
Right.
Now, the whole dust and ashes thing, it's only used like 3 times in the whole Bible. And it's very clear. Abraham uses it back in Genesis, and he's clearly using it to mean human beings in their materiality, where our bodiliness, we're made from dust, and ashes, that sense of decay or dissolution. So it has to do with the human condition as mortal, limited. And it's oftentimes used in, as he does there, in contrast to the divine. So some people would say this can mean concerning the human condition or concerning frail humanity. It can also have some connotation of humility edging over into humiliation.
I'm just going to read for us Genesis 18:27. This is God has told Abraham that he is planning to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham's trying to argue God down, and he says, "Let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes." Right. So using that idiom to talk about his distance ontologically, perhaps from God, his humiliation before God.
And I think that's another clue. It fits in with what we were talking about in the previous verses, that Job has had an encounter with the holy other God. And so now somehow he's thinking also in terms of what it means to be a human being in the light of this encounter and God's description of the cosmos. So how do you locate and think about human existence in that context? So we've got some clues by which we may be able to make some of these possible translations less likely in context. Now, I want to go back to the fact that this word, I'll use the Hebrew, nichamti, when he says, I've changed my mind, or I'm comforted, or not. That word came up very critically in the prose tale, because when Job's friends come to him initially, they come to comfort and console him. And so now he uses that word again. The friends had not succeeded in comforting and consoling him. Now he says he is, and his actions following indicate that he is. Now, for this, though, we need to say, because that term, comforted or console, that's very culturally specific. And what people would mean about it in contemporary Western culture, it's not necessarily the meaning that it would have here. But I think we'd recognize what they're talking about. It does not mean, and so I feel fine. It does not mean I'm happy. What it means is, following my ritual period of mourning and grieving, which is an absolutely essential part of dealing with loss. But there comes a point in which we have to resume ordinary life again. And so traditionally, this was marked, and there's several passages in the Bible that talk about this process. Usually it lasted, well, at least in some contexts, it seems to have lasted 7 days. And so then at the end of that period, a person would usually get up from a sitting position, wash, put on fresh or clean clothes, share a meal with friends and relatives, and oftentimes have sex, which I think is interesting, because in the aftermath of loss of life, there is an action which affirms life. And then one would go back and take up the occupations of daily living.
Right.
And if you look at the epilogue, that is what happens.
Yeah.
Not every one of those are detailed, but Job's relatives come. He shares a meal with him. He accepts a financial contribution from them. Implicitly, he has sex with his wife because they have more children. And his affairs, even though it says that God blesses him, I don't think all of these cattle and sheep fall out of the air. Job will have had to have re-engaged his activities as a person who not only is responsible for himself, but for the well-being of his entire extended family.
Yeah.
It's amazing how abbreviated all that is, right? It's like you have to supply that he resumed all these activities before he has these children. Yeah. And that he did the farming and all the agricultural work before he multiplied his cattle and all that.
Yeah. And there again, I think that this is a story which doesn't want to spell it all out for us, and leaves us, because again, Job doesn't ever say another word in the epilogue. And so we do have to just spend some time thinking about what are the significance of the actions. But the key word, I think, and what takes me in the direction of saying Job says, I am comforted, is that it's the bookend to his failure to be comforted earlier. Now that sends us back into thinking, what in the world in those divine speeches leads him to be comforted? Not in the sense of everything is okay, but in the sense of, I see that the world is not the world I thought it was. I see that the world is probably not even the world I wanted it to be, and still would like for it to be, probably. But this is the world that is. Yeah. And now I either have a choice. I can stay on my ash heap, or I can say, this is a world in which I'm willing to live. Yeah. This is a world in which I'm willing to be in community.
Yeah. One of the things that's really helpful about the way you just put that is that it helps to explain why God in the speeches is not all warm and fuzzy.
Yeah.
Right? Because as you pointed out, to be comforted here is not to feel good.
Yeah.
It's about giving up the morning ritual and re-entering into life. And so God doesn't have to be warm and fuzzy to get Job to realize what life is going to be like, the kind of things that you said. I mean, I think that helps with some of the difficulty that people have with this kind of reading of Job's response. Another thing to just support that reading for is Necham, that Hebrew word. It does appear several times in the book, and every other time I think comfort is a better understanding. One prominent one is chapter 16, verse 2. Job is saying to the friends, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Right?
Yeah.
That same word there.
Yeah.
So it's pointing to what you said at the beginning in chapter 2. The friends come and they have this responsibility to comfort him, to help him re-enter into community, put his mourning aside. And they do this terrible job of it. Yeah. And so finally, God has to step in and do the job for them, which I think helps really pull the whole book together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's still, and I'm not fully sure that this is any more of a wrap up than the epilogue is. Job does make that decision to say, yes, I will live again in this world. But I think that there are some residual tensions. Joe, well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, as soon as I said it pulls the whole book together, I thought, well, Carol's not going to be happy with that.
But I mean, it does in the sense that it gives us those places that we have to say these things are connected, but it's still going. But every time, this is what I love about the book. Every time we think we've made it harmonious, there's something about it that will disturb that sense of, now I've got it. I don't have to read this ever again.
Yes. And one of those examples is right here, because we've got 42:6, and then suddenly we move into a different genre altogether. We move from poetry to prose. And then what we encounter here in verses 7 and 8 is also very hard to connect with the rest of the book. But before we get to 7 and 8 specifically, could you talk a little bit about that jolting genre switch here, because that's one of the big things that you explore in the book. What does that do for us as readers?
Well, I think that to have the prologue and the epilogue, here's an exercise that I oftentimes do at the beginning of a class, is that I will literally cut and paste the prologue and the epilogue and give it to students and say, forget the book of Job in the Bible. Just read this. Now, it looks like we've got a little gap in the middle. How would you fill it in? And what they say is, okay, well, after all these things, the friends show up, and apparently they were saying bad things about God. And like Job's wife had been arguing him to give up his piety. And Job, then he must have continued the same way that he did with his wife, saying, oh, no, you're wrong. I'm going to do. And then at the end, Job has, if you will, passed his test and everything we can finish up. That's the coherent story, which, you may have problems with it, but it hangs together by giving us the divine speeches and Job's apparent recognition of something that he thinks that has shifted him and saying that he's comforted. Then we may think, oh, okay, it was a rocky start, but now we've got a coherent book. This is a story about a learning curve, and it's a steep learning curve, but we've made it. And then you get the prose coming back in, and it just wrecks that sense of coherency, because now we're hearing the beginning, but the end doesn't fit anymore because of what's in the middle. And so we're disconcerted. And this probably brings us to 7 and 8.
Yeah. That's right. So we're at 7 and 8, which is God's verdict, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to read that for us. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. Mm-hmm. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. How is it possible, Carol, that the one who, rails at God, Job, and whom God has charged with speaking without knowledge is correct, in fact. And the friends, on the other hand, who defended God are not right.
Yeah. Like I say, this is why so many scholars for so many years said, oh, no, we've just got a bad cut and paste job here. The editor just didn't know what he was doing and gave us, because this would fit if we just had the prose story that was the way we described it a minute ago. Now we've got a flat contradiction. And some people have tried to soften that by the phrase that you read is what is correct. And they say, or what is right. They say, no. What it means is correctly, in the sense that Job was sincere and honest and open, and the friends were a little hypocritical. But the word doesn't mean correctly or rightly. It means content, the content. So we got a flat contradiction.
So the word means that the content of Job's speech is right.
I think this is, the people have argued this differently, but I find that fairly persuasive that we can't give ourselves an out by turning it into an adverb. So we got to deal with it. And frankly, that's where I'm always suspicious of myself, when I find myself doing the exegesis in a way that's going to lessen the problems. This is not a book that lets you off the hook. So we got to go with the tougher reading, which is God is saying, Job spoke what is right of me. He may. Job may be speaking what is right of God. After all, the divine speeches, one of the radical things that they say is that the world is not set up to ensure justice. The world is not set up with human beings at the center so that God's actions are a response to what people do, rewarding the good, punishing the bad. In the divine speeches, humans are pretty marginalized, and there is God praises and celebrates the creatures that are associated with the chaotic and those things that terrified ancient Israelites. So how would we put this in modern terms? God is the God of viruses as much as the God of human beings. We don't have a privileged position, but Job has also, in many respects, been pointing some of this out. Now, some of his words are directly accusatory, that God is hostile and violently aggressive. And there's no basis in the book that would be necessarily a correct reading. But nevertheless, a good deal of what Job has said is probably something that most readers still feel drawn into. These are things that don't feel right about where we find ourselves. These are things that we're not done with those feelings. We're not done with being angry at God sometimes. And so having that little contradiction, it sort of keeps us from forgetting how drawn we were to what Job was saying.
Yeah.
And that's why, there's no way we can smooth this out into a complicated explanation that's going to make all the little pieces fit together. Nope. It's just going to sit there as contradictory.
Right.
Yeah.
But in that, it fits into this broader tension that we encounter across the Hebrew Bible of these people who are willing to accuse God and argue with God. And Job actually fits into this broader tradition. We already looked at Genesis 18.
Yeah.
And there, Abraham says to God, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" Right?
Yes,
So that tension that Carol's pointing to is a tension that is there throughout the Hebrew Bible. And so Job, there's a sense, I don't know if this fits within that word that's translated correct or right. He's speaking within an acceptable or accepted, at least, tradition of talking to God. Whether that means every little detail of what Job says is theologically shakes out or not. I'm not sure if we have to say that or what do you think? Carol, we do?
What I think is important here is that, and I think you're exactly right by saying what we have here is a microcosm of a tension that's throughout the Hebrew Bible. And that is, in the divine speeches are radical because they seem to challenge the notion that God is fundamentally about justice and the moral order. A lot of the Bible gives warrant for saying that. But these speeches also articulate another view of God's relationship to creation, in which it's not clear where we place God's investment in justice. It's not necessarily that God doesn't necessarily show up and say, "I'm not in the justice business." But neither can we assume that it's the center, the privileged point. Now, human beings, we are in God has commanded us to do justly. And this is where I think Job experiences his world, I think, is finally tragically shaped, in the sense that tragedy is the occurrence of when you have there are two contradictory realities and you have to live at the intersection of them. Right. And so on the one hand, yes, human beings, by understanding ourselves to be in the likeness and image of God, are called to make moral communities. And we understand that to be grounded in the divine. But we also look at this wider frame of creation in which God is the God of viruses as well as the God of human beings. And it's just not so simple to make a single picture out of all of this. And that's why I think Job, it's not that he says, "Oh, happy day, I understand everything. Now I can go back and live in contentment." He's going to always be living in the tension of justice is not the only principle in the cosmos. I'm going to bring my children into a world. I couldn't protect my first family. I lost them. But I'm going to bring more children into this world, knowing that life may not treat them fairly. Awful things will, in fact, happen to them, just as good things will happen to them. As Job said early on, shall we accept what's good and not also accept what's bad from the hand of God.
Yeah.
And so I think it's living in that tension that this contradiction is trying to direct us back to.
Yeah. Now, more briefly, we didn't talk about how the friends are wrong.
Yeah.
just briefly, so we can move on to the rest of the epilogue. How are the friends wrong? They seem to be defending God.
Mm-hmm. They have sometimes been called, it has been said of them that they have basically a therapeutic response to the problem of evil. Because, even though most people say, oh, well, they blame Job and they blame the victim, not entirely. The thing is that they just think that's the wrong way to set up the problem. The issue is, well, let's see what we can do about the situation. Let's give you some strategies for coping. And while that's not exactly bad, I mean, it can be very helpful. It's probably not an adequate theological response to Job's situation. And so if there is a sense in which in the whole book as a whole, not just if we cast them as the blasphemers, but in the book as a whole, if we go back and we have to think, well, what is so off about them? Then it's probably that a merely therapeutic response doesn't finally do justice to Job's situation or who God is. So I don't know that I can really answer that.
Yeah.
But that's sort of where I find them perhaps most problematic.
Great.
Now, Carol, in verses 14 to 15, we're told the names of Job's daughters. He named the first Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Happuch. Thanks for giving me the names to read well. In all the land, there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. Why is it, Carol, that only Job's daughters are named and not his sons?
Well, we don't know. I mean, obviously, daughters, though they were certainly loved and cherished in Israelite antiquity, as in every culture, they didn't have the same kind of status and role in continuing the family. So this is one of the few details we get that would give us an insight into Job's state of mind. And so I think it would have been diluted if we had gotten the names of all of the 7 sons as well. So narratively, this stands out and says, pay attention to this. Now, what's important is the meanings of those names. He names Jemima, dove, and the second one, now I've lost her name, Keziah, which means cinnamon. And then my favorite, the third, Karen Happuch, which means box of eyeshadow. So if you think about the, when way back in Samuel, when the priest Eli's daughter-in-law gives birth in a very troubled time in Israel, she names him Ichabod, the glory has departed. So people's names reflected the context of their births. And so here, Job is giving his daughters beautiful names that have to do with sensuous elements, the fragrance of cinnamon, the beauty of eyeshadow. So this is a life-affirming gesture. And that's one of the few clues we have about his state of mind.
That's amazing to think about. I've never thought about it this way before, but that idea that Job actually can see beauty in the world.
Yes.
Which when you read like chapter 19, for example, the first half of chapter 19, it's impossible to imagine him naming daughters these kinds of things.
And if you think about, people who have endured great losses, it can take a long time before, even someone who's undergone a major depression, one of the things that's most characteristic is your inability to feel pleasure and joy. And so this comes as an indication of someone who has not just grudgingly gone back into life, but has found in ways that we are never told explicitly how it happens. He has found the ability to re-embrace life.
Yeah.
And there's something very, very fascinating about that little detail.
Yeah, it's rich and encouraging. What about the little detail about him giving an inheritance to these daughters along with their brothers? Do you think that that's significant as well?
Yes. And here's one of those places where, I am inclined to read it according to my desires. I don't know whether or not this is the intent of the author, but, I like the fact that typically women didn't inherit unless there were no sons. And so here, Job seems to be embracing them. It's a kind of a non-hierarchical way of looking at his family. And you have to wonder if the divine speeches that showed Job the beauty of all of these creatures that he had either looked down on or feared or whatever, and God talks about them in terms of their beauty and magnificence. Maybe it's transformed Job's way of looking at the world as well. And he's no longer so tied into the traditions and norms and rules of his society. So I think there's something joyous in that too.
Yeah, joyous and generous and gracious.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're now to the final two verses of the book of Job. So 42:16 to 17. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations. And Job died, old and full of days. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that as a conclusion to this magnificent book?
Yeah, I really like it. You do have the sense here again. The 140 years, it's twice the traditional lifespan. So there is a sense, again, I think this goes with that theme that we were talking about of abundance and of life that after the loss and the tragedy, life returns in abundance. And so also, to see your children, 4 generations of children and grandchildren. It's again fulfillment. And it's the last line is literally, to have Job died. A life isn't complete until it is lived to the end, and the end of life was considered extremely important in antiquity. And so to have Job satisfied with days, literally, that is, again, a suggestion that he embraces his life. And so in that regard, we do get, if you will, a rounding off of the book, not in the sense of, and they all lived happily ever after. Because we found so many spots where we think there's a lot. This process of coming back into life is not easy. And we've seen the possibilities of Job still having to negotiate what he wishes life was like and what he has to recognize it's life. So I don't think that it's just a happily ever after, but instead it is one in which meaningfulness and significance and embeddedness is still possible. Yeah. And so I find it very satisfying.
Well, if a life isn't complete until it's lived to the end, a podcast on Job is not complete until it's podcasted to the end.
Yes.
We want to thank you, Carol, for leading us through this last chapter of Job. We just have one more question.
Yeah, Carol, drawing on the genre that, biblical scholars like to use of the book blurb.
Right?
Yes,
You're an expert in genre, so I know you'll be able to dive right into this.
Is there a book, or it could be a movie, or some kind of activity you've picked up, or something that you'd like to blurb for us and for our listeners so that they could, pick it up for themselves?
Yeah, I will. It's something that actually a friend recommended to me a couple of weeks ago. We've all been just bombarded during these past 2 years with what seems like overwhelming experiences and news of tragic events and things that make us anxious. And our mental health has been a struggle for people to deal with all of these. And so someone suggested to me this book by Pema Chodron, who is a Buddhist teacher in the United States, When Things Fall Apart, which is it's called Hard Advice for Difficult Times. And it takes it's obviously written from a Buddhist perspective about how not to run away from those difficult times, but how to live within them. And I think it's a very insightful book, either for Buddhists, for the Buddhist curious among the other people, or for people who have never encountered Buddhism at all. So yes, I would say it's a challenging book, and I think it's one that is very timely and goes well, I think, with the reading of the Book of Job.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Did you see any resonances there between reading that book and Job?
It would be superficial of me, I think, to try to draw connections too closely. But the fact that neither one of them backs away from the fact of an awful situation and trying to live within that situation. So they would make very interesting dialogue partners, but that would take longer than our podcast.
Well, Carol, we want to thank you for being a very interesting dialogue partner in this episode. And for you listeners, if this journey through Job has given you a new appreciation for beauty in the world, and you think maybe this podcast might be part of that beauty, or at least you might be grateful that it's opened your eyes to that beauty. One way that you could express your gratitude,
they could give us comfort.
And it would give us some comfort.
Right?
Is you could go to Apple Podcasts. You could give us a rating. One of those 5-star ratings would be much appreciated because it helps other people find the podcast. Or you could share this with someone else, share with a friend or a neighbor. So we're really grateful for that. And as always, you can connect with us on our website or on Twitter or on our Facebook group. Ask questions, and we'll be happy to try and address those as we can. But until next time, thanks for joining us on the journey.
The Two Testaments is produced with the support of Stanford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to Cameron Thomas and Vanessa Kynes for lending us their voices, the team in the Faculty Success Center for their guidance, and our student assistants, Harrison Pike, Amy Johnston, and Whitney Fix, for their help with production, editing, and promotion.